Okay, this is Physiology Week 13, and in this presentation we're going to look at the skin. The fancy way of saying skin is the integumentary system, and this is in Chapter 7 of your textbook. One of the things I'd like you to look up in your textbook are 6 important functions of the skin. And I think one of the obvious important functions is protection. So the skin offers us protection from UV rays, it offers protection from invading pathogens, and physical protection. So other than that, as one important function, what are an additional 5 important functions? And you'll find these on pages 94 and 95. Our skin is made up of 2 layers. The outer layer is called the epidermis, and that's primarily made up of epithelial tissue. In the epidermis, most of the layers of cells are either dead skin cells or dying skin cells. The only layer of living cells is the very bottom layer of the epidermis, and that's because this is the only layer of cells that actually receives a blood supply. Underneath the dermis is a layer of very dense connective tissue, and it's within this layer, this receives blood supply, so all of the cells in this layer are living, and this is where all the major structures of the skin are found. Underneath the skin is a layer of fat called the hypodermis, or subcutaneous tissue, and it offers to pad us, insulate us, and it also helps anchor the skin to underlying organs like muscle. This is a cross-section through the skin, and we can see the yellow. These are all of the dead skin layers. Underneath that is the bottom layer of the epidermis. So that's all living cells. All of this brown stuff is all dermis. That's the second layer of the skin. And this structure right here happens to be a sweat gland located in the dermis. So we'll look at the epidermis first. So as I said, this lower layer, the bottom layer of cells, get a blood supply. So they are living and they divide, and they actually continue to divide all through life. Because they're able to divide, we replace our entire epidermal layer once every 35 to 40 days. So what happens is as these new cells divide, they get pushed upwards towards the outer layer of the skin and away from the blood supply. And so then they die. When they die, they actually fill with a very, very tough protein called keratin. And that keratin, we're going to talk about in the next slide, is very important for giving our skin its durability. So this is a closer look of the epidermis. Again, we can see the bottom layer of cells that are living, but that as they divide and get pushed up towards the surface, they die. And fill with keratin. Now keratin is very tough and it's water repellent. So that's what gives our skin its waterproofness. It's why we don't absorb water when we're in the shower, and it's why we don't lose a lot of water from inside our body. And that also is very, very tough. So it protects us from physical, chemical, bacterial, viral damage and invasion. So this is keratin is also what is found in our nails and in our hair that gives our nails and our hair its toughness. This is a very high magnification view of the outer layer of the epidermis. You can see how these cells are all flattened and they're filled with that waterproof, tough keratin. So because the epidermis is constantly replacing itself, what quantity of skin do you think that we shed each year? Half a pound, 1 pound, 6 pounds, 9 pounds, or 30 pounds of skin? And the answer is number 4, 9 pounds of skin. So we're constantly flaking off these dead skin cells, and that's what accounts for about 80% of house dust. Within the deepest layer of the epidermis are some specialized cells scattered throughout. These are living cells. They're called melanocytes, and they produce a pigment called melanin. And this pigment is released by these cells. There's a melanocyte there, and the pigment is actually absorbed by the surrounding cells, turning those cells that same pigment. So our skin color is determined by how much of this pigment is produced. If we produce a lot of this melanin, then our skin is very dark. And if we produce a small amount of this melanin, it's very light. If we don't produce any melanin, such as the case of albinism, then our skin would be very translucent, almost whitish with no color at all. Now melanin has a very important function, star, star, star. So melanin acts like a little umbrella that sits on top of the cell's DNA, and it shields it from things like UV rays, things that may damage that DNA. So it does protect the skin cells. So part of how much melanin we produced is genetic, but our melanin production within a person can change depending upon exposure to certain things. So for example, exposure to UV rays from the sun causes more melanin to be produced, and that changes our skin color, which we would call tanning. Heat can affect the amount of melanin. Chemicals and drugs can do that, hormones and hormone levels. Certain skin diseases, such as, for example, vitiligo, is a disease which decreases melanin production, so the skin becomes blanched in that area, or X-rays. Beneath the epidermis is the dermis, and as I mentioned earlier, this is where most of the major structures of the skin are located. So this is where we have our pain, touch, and temperature receptors. This area is filled with blood vessels, and of course those blood vessels have a couple important functions. One is that they can dilate to bring blood close to the surface of the body so that we can lose heat. Those blood vessels also keep all those cells alive. My favorite type of cells are in this area, phagocytes, right, that absorb and eat invading pathogens like bacteria. This area of the skin is also filled with collagen and elastic fibers that hold on to moisture, which keeps our skin hydrated. It gives our skin some toughness and also elasticity. As we get older, those collagen elastic fibers start to degenerate, and as a result we lose some of that moisture, so skin becomes drier and it becomes less elastic or saggy, and we call that wrinkles. Also located in this section are different glands, two main different types of glands. One of them are sweat glands, and sweat glands produce sweat, which is mostly water but also contains dissolved in that water salt, sodium chloride, and some waste products like urea and uric acid, which is what makes our sweat acidic, and interestingly enough also vitamin C. Because our sweat is acidic, that actually has a protective function, so that inhibits the growth of bacteria on the surface of our skin. And of course, sweat is also important for temperature control in cooling us down. Sweat is normally odorless unless it is produced by glands in your armpits and groin area, and that's because sweat glands in those specific areas produce a protein and fat also, and bacteria love that. They eat on it, and then the bacteria produce a waste product that is smelly, and that's what we consider body odor. So these arrows are pointing to a sweat gland, so there's the gland itself, and there's the duct that leads the sweat out to the surface of the skin. And this is just a look into a sweat gland. We also have oil glands in this layer of the skin. They're called sebaceous glands, and they produce sebum, which is a combination of oil and then fragments of cells. And the oil this sebum is secreted by the gland, that's indicated by this arrow, and then moves out into the shaft of a hair follicle, and then moves up to the surface of the skin in that pathway, and then it lubricates the surface of the skin. It also has an antibacterial component so that it inhibits the growth of bacteria. So just by the way, this hair shaft is connected to a little muscle called the erector pili muscle, and when it's stimulated by a nerve, and this is a sympathetic nerve, so it happens if we're really angry or afraid or if we're cold, and it causes this muscle to contract, and that makes the hair stand on end, and that's what we call goosebumps. And that helps warms us up, because then we get a layer of air trapped under the hair that acts like a little portable down jacket. Here's a couple pictures of the sebaceous gland. On the left side, this is a high magnification view of the gland. Here we see a hair shaft, and this is where the sebum will enter. And this is a lower magnification on the right. This yellow arrow indicates the sebaceous gland. The red arrow is the hair. And of course, the sebaceous gland is producing sebum. And if this becomes blocked, if too much sebum is produced and it blocks that hair shaft, then we end up with a little bump that has sebum underneath, and we call that a pimple. We're going to look at some disorders of the skin, and we're going to look at kind of 4 main categories, and the 5th I would like you to do some research on your own. So we're going to look at hypersensitivity or allergic types of reactions and other immune diseases. We're going to look at infections, tumors. There are lots of causes that are idiopathic or unknown. We're going to talk about one particular common example, and then I'd like you to look up injury, especially burns, and that's on page 105. So if you remember, an allergy is just an exaggerated immune response. So it's an abnormal response of your immune system to invasion of some sort of protein. So it could be pollen, it could be some food, or it could be contact with something as well. So we say that this is a hypersensitive reaction. Your immune system is hypersensitive. And when your immune system reacts, it releases histamine. And histamine is what causes the symptoms of an allergy. So in the case of the skin, most of the allergic reactions are because you've come in contact with something that your immune system reacts with. And that triggers the release of histamine from white blood cells, and then we get blood vessels that dilate, which make it red. We get fluid that moves into that area, which makes it swollen, and then we end up seeing that type of allergic reaction. So we call this contact dermatitis, and it could be any type of irritant to you in particular. So that could be soap or cosmetics or chemicals. Latex is a big one. Paints, different plants such as poison ivy or poison oak, that is an allergic reaction. Jewelry and different types of adhesives. Up in the upper right corner here, this is a reaction to a soap. In the bottom left, this is a poison ivy reaction. Not everybody is allergic to poison ivy, but about 90% of humans have an allergic reaction to poison ivy. And on the bottom right here, this is a contact dermatitis caused by a Band-Aid in which the person has an allergic reaction to the adhesive. So this is something that you'd really have to watch for. Of course, treatment for any type of allergic reaction would be, 1, prevention, so avoid the irritants. So if you know that a person is allergic to adhesives, to use different type of Band-Aid. And the other is, because it's triggered by the release of histamine, then a person could use a topical antihistamine in a cream or take an oral antihistamine drug. Hives, or Urticaria, this is a systemic reaction to a particular allergen. So this is an allergic reaction where the allergen is actually moved into the bloodstream, and so hives is a systemic reaction. It's occurring all over the body. And again, the mediator is histamine. So again, treatment would be, in this case, oral antihistamines because it is systemic. So when plasma leaks out of blood vessels, it causes these raised lesions that we call wheals, and sometimes the lesions are a lighter color than the surrounding skin, and sometimes they're a darker color. A skin disorder that is related to the immune system, but we're not exactly sure how it's related, is eczema or atopic dermatitis. And again, we're not exactly sure what the underlying cause is. We do know that it runs in families along with asthma and allergies. So those 3 different conditions, asthma, allergies, and eczema, tend to run together in families. We know that there's a connection between food allergies in infancy and development of eczema. And we also know that there are certain triggers that will cause a flare-up of eczema, and then it will go away for a while. So things like stress, humidity, changes in temperature will cause an outbreak of a skin disorder. It looks like this. Sometimes eczema occurs in kids, and then it will disappear as an adult. Arms and legs are particularly vulnerable to outbreaks of eczema. So infections can occur in the skin, and those infections can be of any type of pathogen. So they could be viruses, bacteria, fungus, or parasites. So viral infections of the skin include, several different types of viruses. However, the most common one is herpes, and herpes is a whole family of viruses, and they cause inflammation of the skin, and they cause little fluid-filled, almost blister-like vesicles to appear in whatever area that the virus is in. These little vesicles are painful. Herpes, even once your immune system has dealt with an outbreak of herpes, the virus actually still remains dormant in the nerve endings and can be reactivated. So once a person has had an outbreak of herpes, that virus will remain with them for life, and periodically can reactivate. And that could be triggered by all kinds of things, including UV rays, stress, fever, trauma, those types of things. And so that's why we say that it's recurrent. The most common type of herpes viral infection of the skin is herpes simplex type 1. That's the virus that causes cold sores. And again, you can see these are these little fluid-filled vesicles, and with cold sores, it's usually around the mouth and nose. With herpes simplex type 2 or herpes genitalis, it's the same type of fluid-filled blisters, but around the genital area. All herpes viruses are highly contagious, but they're spread by direct contact. Chickenpox is caused by a herpes variation of herpes virus called herpes varicella zoster, and again, highly contagious. If a person has had herpes varicella as a child, so has had chickenpox as a child, then the virus can remain dormant and it can be reactivated, and that's what we call shingles. And these are fluid-filled, painful vesicles that run along the course of a nerve. Human papillomavirus, or HPV, this is the virus that causes warts. It's also the virus that's been linked with cervical cancer. And so that's why recently kids, especially young girls not only young girls in grade 8, 7, and 8, have started to receive vaccinations against HPV. And but when it causes warts, the virus actually invades those dead skin cells on the surface of the epidermis, the ones that are filled with keratin, and they cause those skin cells to expand or get larger, hypertrophy, and that's what creates this bump. There are many different types of warts depending upon where they're located. So flat warts, common warts, plantar warts are usually on the sole of the feet. That's what we see on this foot right here, or genital warts. When they're on the soles of the feet, they can be quite painful because, of course, that lump of larger skin cells then puts pressure onto the tissue that's underlying them. Warts themselves may not need to be treated at all. They're not dangerous, but they may be painful, and there may be some cosmetic reasons why you want to remove them. The idea is that you have to kill the virus that's inside those cells. So either they're frozen using liquid nitrogen, or we spread a little salicylic acid on the surface of them. That's the active ingredient in products like Durafilm or Durafilm, and that just eats away the dead skin cells and exposes the virus, and then the virus is killed gradually, and you have to do it many nights in a row till you work down through those all hypertrophied cells. A really easy way to get rid of warts is duct tape. And now you have to leave the duct tape over top of the wart for about 2 weeks, but something in the adhesive of the duct tape will kill the virus inside that wart. Bacteria can invade the skin as well. There are two main types of bacteria that are the most common ones to create skin infection, and that's Staphylococcus, which is what you see here, looks like bunches of grapes, or Streptococcus, which looks like beads on a string, or strep infections. Bacterial infections are often highly contagious. A person that has a suppressed immune system is very vulnerable to bacterial infections, or if there's very poor personal hygiene and we're not constantly, washing off bacteria, particularly if there are breaks in the skin, then they're more susceptible to bacterial infections as well. A really common type of bacterial infection, especially in kids and especially in places where kids are in high concentrations and may not have the best personal hygiene, so aka summer camp, and it's called impetigo. And often when we start to see outbreaks of impetigo within a summer camp, many different kids end up being affected. And this is again where bacteria, could be either staph or strep bacteria, enter through a break in the skin, and they create these little pustules that have a sort of a yellowish oozing pus, and then they crust over, and we often see it around nose and mouth and on the face. One type of bacterial infection that you really need to be aware of are pressure ulcers, and in layman's terms we would call them bedsores, but they are really, I prefer the term pressure ulcers because they don't just happen in a bed. Pressure ulcers occur when there is pressure against the skin that is prolonged, and it restricts the blood supply to that area of the skin. And so then those cells start to die, and then little cracks form in the skin, and bacteria invade, and it creates an infection. What happens then is that this infection will create a little crater in the skin, a little hole that takes the body a long time to fill in. And so once a pressure ulcer has occurred, it can take a long time to heal, and it can be really tricky, particularly if that pressure, source of pressure, is still there. So the secret with pressure ulcers is to recognize them early on and then to prevent them from happening. So if you start to see an area of the skin that looks very red where there's been friction, or is blanched, so it's white because it's not getting enough blood supply, then you really need to look at what's causing that prolonged pressure. So that could be because a person is lying in a bed for a long period of time and not being moved very often, and so there's pressure especially to the bum, to their shoulders, to their elbows, and maybe heels, back of the head. Or it could be somebody that is in an ill-fitting wheelchair or is using ill-fitting prosthetics, and again there's this constant pressure in the one point all the time. So really important to check people that are using a wheelchair or are in bed for long periods of time, to make sure that you're checking for those red or white blanched points. As I said, once the bacteria invades, it will start to cause an infection that will ultimately create a little hole. And again, it takes the skin a long time to regenerate enough cells to fill that hole, and it takes a long time to heal. Acne, as we discussed, is caused by overactive sebaceous glands in the skin. And when there's too much sebum that's produced, it blocks that hair follicle, and sometimes you can get an actual infection underneath that occurs. And we end up with this little white bump that's filled with sebum and maybe trapped bacteria, and that's what we call a pimple. If the top comes off that and it looks black underneath, that's because it's oxidized, and that's what we call a blackhead. If an infection occurs around underneath the skin, around that pocket, we say that that is inflammatory acne. And that can occur for a number of reasons, including trying to pop a pimple, and that then it doesn't escape through the top, and it actually ruptures that little pocket beneath the surface of the skin. Bacteria can invade a wound, and a tricky thing is to determine if a wound has actually been infected with bacteria. So because initially, whenever you injure tissue, you're going to get an inflammatory response. So there's going to be redness and swelling and heat, and that's because the body is bringing blood to that area and white blood cells, and to prevent infection and to promote healing. However, if you start to see that redness start to expand and swelling to increase, it's getting hotter and it's getting worse instead of better, and or if you see a yellowish pus coming out of the wound, then that's a sign that there's bacteria, and you can use a local antibacterial, or it could be that a person may need oral antibiotics. Particularly if you see this, so in the upper right corner here, if you start to see these streaks, red streaks going away from the wound and heading up towards the heart, that is a sign that the infection has actually entered the bloodstream. So we call that a systemic infection, and that can create septic shock. And so that's a medical emergency, and a person needs to be seen by a physician right away. Down below here, this is an abscess. So this is where we actually get a pocket of infection beneath the surface of the skin. And we just see a little head at the top, and usually it's painful in this entire area. And abscesses sometimes need to be lanced, and the pocket of infection expressed out the little hole, and then the hole kept open with packing until the body has a chance to heal that little pocket that's beneath the skin. That usually happens with wounds that have a very narrow opening, like a puncture wound. Fungus can infect the skin as well. There are many different species of fungus. One of the most common ones is tinea. This is called by the trichophyton fungus, and like all fungus, it thrives in hot, humid conditions and creates itching, cracking, and weeping of the skin. This top picture is Tinea corporis, which is ringworm. That's the fungus that causes ringworm. And the bottom is athlete's foot, Tinea pedis. Candidiasis is another species of fungus that causes fungal infections on the skin. And often happens if we disturb the normal flora of the skin, mouth, vagina, and intestines, which often occurs when taking antibiotics. And so we get rid of our normal bacteria, and then other fungus invades. So that's what causes vaginal yeast infections. This on the left here is thrush. This often occurs in infants that are breastfeeding if mom is taking antibiotics, and it's very easily treated with a topical antifungal. Diaper rash is another candidiasis infection. Dandruff can be, there are a couple sources of causes of dandruff, but one could be a fungal infection. There are many, many, many skin diseases that are what we call idiopathic, meaning we have no idea what the underlying cause is. Probably one of the most common idiopathic diseases is psoriasis. And in psoriasis, there's excessive division of the skin, and so a person gets a built-up layers of skin cells, which creates kind of a leathery, raised, crusty area, and scaling. There is some hereditary parts to psoriasis. It tends to run in families, but that's not the only factor. And again, psoriasis is something that can come and go. Outbreaks are often triggered by stress, by infection, hormonal changes, or skin trauma. So often by things that affect our immune system. Skin cancer is caused by mutations of DNA within the skin. In the case of basal cell and squamous cell carcinoma, the mutation occurs in those living deep bottom layer of epidermal cells, and when the mutation occurs, the cell loses control of its division, and they divide uncontrollably, and they create a mass of cells, and this can spread into the dermis and into the subcutaneous tissue. The most common cause of those DNA mutations is UV rays, and so that's why we usually find skin cancers on areas that get a lot of sun, so especially nose and cheeks, maybe top of the head for men that have no hair, tops of shoulders, or top of the back. Basal cell carcinoma is the least aggressive type of skin cancer. It usually grows fairly slowly, and if it's removed, there's a 90% chance that it won't reoccur. Squamous cell carcinoma is much more aggressive, and it often is misdiagnosed as basal cell carcinoma in the beginning, but then it rapidly starts to grow and it can metastasize. The most aggressive type of skin cancer occurs in the melanocytes, those cells that produce pigment, and that's why malignant melanoma often starts in areas where there's lots of pigment, like freckles and moles. And so this is why we need to check moles and make sure that they're not growing or becoming abnormal. Malignant melanoma grows and metastasizes to lymph very quickly, so it can start secondary tumors in other parts of the body. So some of the things you want to look for, asymmetry. So two sides of the mole don't match. They have, abnormal shapes, and a regular border, like the one both of these that you see on this side are malignant. Odd colors, particularly moles that have more than one color, and certainly if they are large, and especially if they are growing rapidly, if they're actually getting bigger. Now, if you've had a weird mole since you were a baby and it's the same size and the same weirdness as it ever was, it's not malignant melanoma. But if you suddenly see the appearance of a weird looking mole, then that's something to get checked out. The last section that we're going to look at are infections or infestations of parasites. And a parasite is an organism that lives on or in another organism, which we call its host, so that would be us. And the parasite benefits from the host, but the host doesn't get anything out of the relationship. The two most common parasitic infections that we see are scabies and lice. And on the left here, this is a scabies mite, and on the right, that is a louse. So scabies is caused by a very tiny mite. They don't fly or leap, they crawl, and so you have to come in direct contact with somebody that has scabies in order for the mite to crawl onto you. They migrate to places that are nice and warm, so in the groin area, under the breasts, between fingers and toes. And what they do is they burrow and they make these little tunnels under the skin, and they lay eggs and they bite and feed, and that is what creates the irritation, the redness, and the itching that occurs. Scabies is treated with permethrin, and it's usually in a type of soap. Permethrin 5%. Don't use anything with lindane, that is very toxic. And you soap up from the neck down, and you leave it on and for a while, and then you rinse it off, and that should get rid of the scabies mites, although a person is going to be itchy probably for the next 3 to 4 weeks, even if all the mites have been removed. Lice is probably the most common parasitic infection, and if you're working with kids in any capacity, then you're likely to run into lice at some point or another in your career. Again, lice don't fly, they don't jump, they're spread by direct contact. They can crawl very fast, so they crawl about 23 centimeters a minute, which is quite fast for something that small. So usually they're spread when kids put, head to head when they're playing, or they share hats, very, or dress up costumes or things like that. We often don't see a louse, a live louse. This is a picture up here of a live louse. They're very small and they crawl fast. And so as soon as you start to look, they kind of crawl into the darker places in the head. But what we will see are lice eggs, and these are called nits, and that's what you see down here. They're little teardrop-shaped eggs, and they're glued very, very firmly to the hair, very close to the scalp, so within about 1 centimeter from the scalp. If you can see a dark area in the center of that little egg, then that's a sign that it contains a live little baby louse. If it's totally clear, like we see on these other 2 strands of hair, then it's already hatched, and these are just what we call casings. So you're looking for these little nits, and you'll find them very close to the scalp because they need to be there for the egg to incubate and hatch. Usually it takes about 10 days for that egg to incubate, and then it will hatch, and then in another 10 days it will be ready to mate. So that's why you can get quite a large infestation of lice in a relatively quick area of time. Now these little nits are very strongly glued to the hair, so if you can blow it off, or if you can brush it off with your fingers, then it's not a nit. It's probably a piece of dandruff or some other piece of debris that's in the hair and not an actual nit. To get a nit off, you actually have to grab hold of it and pull it along the length of the hair. You know, what do you do with this? Well, there is a shampoo that is medicated. It contains permethrin at a 1% concentration. That's the drug of choice. You usually do one treatment, and then in another 7 days, then you do a second treatment. There are an increasing number of lice infestations that seem to be resistant to this particular drug, so lice are adapting to this. Myself, I feel that a better treatment is a daily treatment of a 50-50 solution of oil and vinegar. So you essentially make a salad dressing and rub it into the surface of the hair, and then you can let it sit there for maybe 15-20 minutes, and then comb out the hair. You'll comb out any live lice that are there, but you'll also then lubricate the nits, and you'll be able to pick off the nits quite a lot easier. And then wash the hair with shampoo, and then repeat it the next day. The biggest trick with any lice treatment, whether you're using a shampoo or whether you're using the salad dressing technique, is that you have to check for nits, and you have to check each tiny little section of hair. You can't just kind of breeze through it. You have to pin the hair up, and you have to be able to see through the layer of hair that you're looking at to be able to spot the nits and to pick those nits off. There is no shampoos that are 100% effective in killing nits, and so those you have to just check on a daily basis, 1 or 2 times a day, and make sure that you're not seeing any nits, especially new nits. If you see casings like this, especially if they're further away from the scalp, then those have already hatched, and you know, those are of less concern than the new ones that are being formed that contain new little organisms in them. Okay, that's the end of the skin section. There will be a HPH Dollars opportunity that will be posted up on Blackboard, and questions from this presentation will be in your last online test as well as on your final test. Okay, have a good day.